Hey, thank you for listening to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness and suicide prevention. I'm your host, Captain Nostalgia, and on this episode, hold your breath because we're talking about 2016's Don't Breathe. Hope you guys enjoy the show. It has been a while since I have been featured on the show. Our schedule's been a little bit wonky. We've been a little bit busy, but it feels great to be back, kind of bringing and starting new projects, like Abyss-Gazing, a horror podcast. I swear, at this point, every episode of Victims and Villains I appear on that's not about horror, I'm just bringing up horror. So it's just like, this is just going to be one long ad for Abyss-Gazing, a horror podcast. I even brought the co-host of that show to do this episode with me.
Yo.
I swear it's not intentional to be one long ad. I promise you guys. Don't Breathe is, but yeah, it's a thing.
In all fairness, we both love horror, and it's like our go-to genre, which is how Abyss-Gazing came to be.
Yeah, it is. If you guys have listened to a lot of the episodes that we've done since Mark has been kind of with us, or even read any of our reviews, majority of them, especially over the last year, have been navigating all towards horror. And we have great people like Shudder and Arrow to really kind of thank for creating this love, and I'm really excited to do this episode. This movie I have only seen once before, and the only thing that I remembered about it outside of how awesome Stephen Lang is how uncomfortable the finale is, and yeah, it's hard to watch even as a second time. So, Mark, this was your first time watching this movie, and we're gearing up for the second film. What did you think about this movie?
So, yeah, and it wasn't one of those that I wasn't watching because I wasn't interested. It was one that, for whatever reason, I would find out it was on a streaming service after it left the streaming service kind of thing. Or when we were renting movies from the Red Box, the kids were here, and I couldn't watch it with the kids at the time, and just little weird stuff like that. So I finally got to watch this movie. And I did not realize that it had the actress that played Mia in the remake of Evil Dead.
Did you realize that this is also the same director?
Yeah, I knew it was a lot of the same, a handful of the same team from the Evil Dead remake, which I love the Evil Dead remake. And this one, it was good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. It had all the violence I wanted from this kind of movie. Yeah, it was a cool one to see for the first time. I authentically like this film. I feel like home invasion movies are so hard to do because they're so easy to make just really bland and uninteresting. Whereas this film, what makes it so compelling is the fact that it builds up characters like Rocky and Alex as well. And even also, I would say that like it even builds up the blind man, Stephen Lang, really well as well. Like there's only a few things that you need to know about him prior to coming into kind of his second and third acts of this movie, but they do enough setting up for him that by the time you get there, you're just like pumped and you're ready for it. And that's what I feel like makes this film so compelling. It's hinted through certain dialogue. They kind of hint at his background. So when the big reveal happens of what his deal really is, it's not a shock, but it's like, wow, he's really jacked up.
Yeah, and even when they talk about, like you said, like they do give exposition, and a lot of it comes through one of the film's weaker elements in the money character. money is just kind of like a super cliche, like I'm gonna break into your house type of archetype that we've seen 1,000 types before. He's really underdeveloped, but they basically use him to kind of give us exposition about Stephen Lang's character, and I feel like they do a really good job at, you know, building him up. But I feel like perhaps what makes this film so compelling for me as a viewer is how sympathetic a lot of these characters are, and you can kind of see why they are driven to the type of life that they're doing, like why they're breaking into people's houses. It's not just like, oh, we're bored, we need money. Like, they're building towards something, and that was an aspect of this movie that I really thought was much needed to help this movie stand apart from other films.
Yeah, because like you said, the home invasion movie is kind of, you know how it's going to go. But you've had entries in that like Mr. Brooks with Dane Cook and Kevin Costner was an interesting twist on the home invasion. It was more of the outside life of Mr. Brooks, who was breaking into people's houses and killing them, as opposed to the whole home invasion. Or Macy Williams and the Owners last year. That was very similar in style to Don't Breathe, with them breaking into this mansion in the countryside and finding out that these old, decrepit couple isn't exactly what they thought they were. And they think in this movie that they're breaking into a blind vet's house who got a big settlement from a rich family that their daughter killed his daughter. And they find out that they walked into a world of hurt.
Yeah, 100%. Let's jump into spoilers real quick. If you guys have not seen Just Breathe, you guys can rent it on any streaming service you guys want. I think the average price is like $3 or $4. Both Mark and I watched this on DVD. So this is your official spoiler warning. If you guys have not seen Don't Breathe, we're about to jump in and just kind of spoil the mess out of it. But I think one of the things that I want to... I also... You brought up the Owners, which was one of the pleasant surprises for me last year. Because you had originally reviewed it for the website, and I reviewed it for our friends over at the Farsighted Network. And one of the things that I felt like really helped that film stand apart as in the home invasion genre is the twist that you have with the antagonists at the end. Like, they're not just these like unsuspecting elderly folk, like they're actually like sadistic and twisted, and they know what they're doing. And that's really what I feel like. Here you have a guy that literally has lost his sight, he's lost his will, and you know he's just content, and to kind of be in this position, he's learned to it. But before we kind of get into Stephen Lang, I feel like the first thing I want to get into is kind of just the trio here at the center of our story. You have Money, Alex, and Rocky, and the opening to their introduction to their scene, so to say, is basically them like robbing a rich guy, and they're very calculated, which is something that I found like really entertaining. How did you feel about the introduction to this?
So the first thing I thought watching that scene was they're idiots and leaving a whole lot of evidence. So they're like handling everything. One guy's peeing on the carpet. I think that was, what was his name? Money? Yeah. He was peeing on the carpet, and it was very obvious that they would have been busted by now, or at least been on some wanted lists. That's the one thing that got me about the opening. But it sets up the characters for that kind of movie. It's your classic couple with the third wheel, almost. which was like The Owners was the same kind of thing. The two were a couple. The one guy was like the third wheel, and then they had the crazy guy. Where in Don't Breathe, Money was the half of the couple and the crazy guy. So there was nothing really out of the ordinary, but it's just the fact that Stephen Lang ended up being far worse than they could ever be is kind of what makes it stand out more from the home invasion genre than movies similar to it.
If you guys listened to our first episode on the abyss gazing, Mark and I have established in that episode, and particularly a lot of the episodes we've done in the past, whether it's been Seder or Ghoulies, is that I have a tendency to like really look a lot at like character motivations and thematic elements that are woven throughout the film. And to put it plainly, I'm the analytical one. Mark just watches and kind of goes with the flow when we podcast.
Yeah, I watch a movie as entertainment and reactionary, where you kind of pick it apart and take all the fun out of it.
But so before I kind of dive into a lot of the themes that the characters go through, I'm at this point with horror and sometimes with some films as well, where just films in general, where I feel like the opening prologue to a movie is basically a shot from the end, and then we're rewinding and telling this. And this just seems to be like within like the last like 5 to 10 years, or maybe I'm not as educated as I believe when it comes to films, but man, like I am kind of getting really annoyed with this kind of like, we're gonna show you this really intense shot and then we're gonna rewind it, and you're gonna see how we got here.
Yeah, even John Wick did that. John Wick opens up after the big like car chase and shootout and fight on the docks. He's wrecking into the side of the vet where he ends up getting his pit bull. And it's, yeah, you see a lot of that these days. The first 5 or 10 minutes is actually the end of the movie. It doesn't bother me, but then you have things like I mentioned earlier, the Evil Dead remake, that the first 10 minutes may not be the end of the movie, but it's pretty much telling you everything you need to know and what's getting ready to happen.
Like, and it's just on this most recent rewatch of it. Like, I want to preface that like it doesn't take anything bad from the movie, but like it's
just a trend.
It's just a trend, and it's a trend that you're setting this like really intense, really gripping like imagery right out of the gate, and then you have to say, okay, well, how did we get to this point? And then that journey to understand the context of that scene never feels like it's as satisfying as that opening scene. And Don't Breathe, not to say that it's Don't Breathe is a bad movie. It never reaches, I feel like, that level of it. And to go back to one of the movies we covered in the Unnamed Film Festival earlier this year, we talked about Posers. Poser was this film that had this really just shots in the air, like just crazy opening, and the rest of the movie was dull. That's not the case with Don't Breathe, but I feel like the context of the opening shot as opposed to like the story that we get afterwards, they never kind of reach each other's like level.
Yeah, it's these kind of openings on movies can do that. They set you up for disappointment or fulfillment, and it depends on how they tell the story as a whole. If they give you something like Don't Breathe, which is Stephen Lang dragging Rocky down the middle of the street by her hair, that's the opening of the movie. You expect And as to quote 10 Things I Hate About You, the shitteth hath hitteth the faneth. And if it didn't live up to that, it was going to be a disappointing movie. Fortunately for them, it did. It was a pretty good movie.
Oh yeah, I absolutely love this movie. I hate this trend. Like, it's like such a sign of the time. Like, when you look at a film from like the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, like, you can look and be like, okay, like, there are some things that are elements of this movie that are signs of their times, whether that's fashion or music or even some of the references. But I feel like in the new millennium, like, we have these like weird trends that just kind of like start. It's not necessarily fashion or music or anything along those lines. It always comes back to these weird trends that happen in horror.
Well, talking about that, I think it was late 80s, early 90s that they started in with the trend of showing your credits while the movie was actually progressing the story, as opposed to previously having a credit sequence, then the movie, then more credits. They started doing the showing the names flashing around on the screen as the movie's actually playing. So that became a trend at one point that's kind of almost stuck. Now you go and see a movie and they almost just start. They may have opening credits, they may not, and it all came from that trend that started. And this is just another one that may or may not stick around long, is showing you the end of the movie first and then showing you everything that led up to it. It's not like they're Christopher Nolan and Memento playing the movie backwards. It's a trend to try to get you tied up in the movie as soon as you start watching it.
No, you're absolutely right. And I feel like when you start to progress past this point, we gotta get to see a lot of these characters, like you had talked about, these trio. Basically, their MO is they target houses, and Rocky is saving up to leave the city behind. And Alex is kind of being like, he's the voice of reason, basically. And he's the guy that has a crush on her. And Money's the guy that's actually with her. But Alex is the entry point to how they get in. His dad basically runs a security company and for wealthy people, and they're basically robbing his dad's clients. And so that's how they basically come up with Stephen Lang's character. He's the next big mark, and they are robbing him with the intentions that they never have to rob anyone ever again. And so they go out and they basically are like patrolling the area and find out he's blind. And then it's like, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. But kind of going back to looking at analytical side, you don't get to see a lot. None of these characters really feel like that fleshed out, except for Rocky. And Rocky, we get a picture of kind of why she wants to leave. Like, she's basically the mother of her house. We get a very brief scene with her at her house. Like, she has a little sister and or niece that lives with them. Her brother lives there. Mother and I want to say brother's girlfriend as well, if I remember correctly. But like, it's just a really toxic area and really toxic environment. Like, she's belittled. She basically is kind of almost has like a Cinderella type situation. And you just kind of see like how that toxicity is like really affecting her emotionally and mentally. And honestly, like, that's a really interesting thing to talk about in terms of mental health, because you're going to either respond to that environment in one of two ways. It's either going to shape you for the future, and you're going to constantly belittle yourself and believe that you're never good enough, or you're going to rise above it like Rocky does and want to leave.
So I would say that Stephen Lang's character is a bit more fleshed out than the other two burglars. Rocky's the only one you get more info on than him, really. They don't talk about him a lot, but what they do tell and what they show gives you who he is. He's a veteran, and with the way he's acting and reacting, and he's dealt with massive trauma with his daughter being killed, and the links he goes to with that whole thing, you really kind of see most likely he's got PTSD. I mean, there's really no way around that, considering his background and everything that's happened, and that he's just kind of lost it and lost himself in it. And they mentioned that he was a vet, that he lost his sight in some war, and they mention the events with his daughter and talk about him. But with telling so little and showing him as the main bad guy in the sense that they did, you learn a lot more than almost any character other than Rocky.
Well, I would dare even say kind of, and I don't want to, like, I didn't bring up her home situation to be like, oh yeah, like she's this movie's about her, because I really do feel like that the reason that they came back for a sequel is because, you know, not only because of the surprise success of this film, but also because I think that fans really wanted to know more about him. And I do, to your point, I do think that his environment and kind of his story is just as important to address and to talk about, because he does go through PTSD. You know, here you have not only a Iraqi veteran, because they do talk about how he went blind during Desert Storm, but you also have a father that lost his daughter, and it's also, what makes it even more tragic is because we don't know really what happened to his wife, or, you know, anything else.
I think, didn't they say that she died? They just didn't say what.
They probably, I mean, it was probably like an offhanded line. But yeah, you're probably right that she did die. So here you have a guy that's experienced double loss, and also loss of sight. And so here you have a guy that's kind of at his breaking point. And what I think is so compelling about Stephen Lang's character is that at the end of the day, like, I mean, he's not looking for any handouts. He's not looking for really anything. Like, he just wants to be left alone, and he's completely content with that. And sometimes I feel like, you know, we talk about, you know, Rocky's home situation, and sometimes with Stephen Lang's situation, I think you really have to, you know, kind of learn, and it's like we were talking about last night, you know, there are some situations that life deals with us that we can't change, but we need to have the courage to change what we can change.
Yeah, and with Stephen Lang's character, if you hear anybody that's military, that was in the thick of it in the Middle East, and hear them tell some of the stuff that they dealt with and got tied up with, it's why one reason it's so easy to see something like post-traumatic stress very prevalent in a lot of these soldiers and military. And you can kind of see that in his character, learning that from him. So it's an interesting take how they did him as a character, as the bad guy in this movie. And with the second one getting ready to come out, everything we've seen on it so far, it's almost like it's almost like the Freddy or Michael Myers twist, where they're making him the main character of the franchise now, even though he's the bad guy. You'll be watching Don't Breathe 2 for Stephen Lang.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, in particularly, like I said, I don't want to like sound like we're trying to compete on as far as like terms of narrative or goals, because we both of us, Mark and I, have different life experiences, and so I think for me, the thing that really made Don't Breathe such a compelling story to be told is that it's a film that is wrapped up in not only toxicity in home environments but also grief. And so we're gonna take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're gonna dissect some of the stranger elements of Don't Breathe. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. We've kind of talked about how much Stephen Lang's character really has lost before we even really kind of get to the finale, or kind of really we get to see what he's made of as a character. And one of the things that I feel like is really just, our introduction to kind of him as, this guy that they're getting ready to rob is the scene where Money walks into the room to basically put him to sleep. And he's watching home movies, like he's literally sleeping to home movies of his daughter playing, and just her voice. And then in the deeper we get into it in the finale, we also see that he has hunted and found his daughter's killer and impregnated her, and so that way Stephen Lang's character can have a new daughter. How did you feel about kind of that like revenge scenario?
It's almost so you find out who it is that he's gotten a hold of and is captive. And then as it progresses a little bit and you find out a little more, to me, it almost felt like they were trying to put something in there to make you dislike him. Because up until that point, you didn't know any of this. You knew his daughter was killed and they make the comment that it was a rich girl and she just got a slap on the wrist with some probation after basically paying him off with a big settlement. So you knew that happened. And he's dealing with, he's asleep and listening to videos of his daughter. And to me, that whole sequence and adding that little side story almost seemed like they were adding that in there to make him more of a villain than a hero.
I mean, he 100% is the villain of this story.
But would he still have been if it ended up being nothing more than him defending his home and these people breaking in with guns and stuff? If you remove that storyline of what was going on in the basement, he's still the villain.
That's a fair set. That's fair. Because the narrative does twist there. But I would argue that from the teenager's perspective, he is the villain. However, here you have a guy that is completely pushed to the edge of his grief. I mean, we joked around about John Wick just a little bit ago, and John Wick, in all seriousness, is this story where you have a guy that basically here he has lost his wife and loses literally the last connection he has to his wife. You know, say whichever you want about it being a dog or whatever. Go listen to our pig episode on the importance of pets and mental health and their relationship. And for Stephen Lang's character, he loses the last connection that not only of family, but also to his wife. And that is enough to really kind of break a person. Like this, to me, I would argue that he's not a villain in the slightest, simply because he's a man grieving. And grief is something that really brings us to do such strange and bizarre things that we wouldn't normally do or endure. And I believe that, like, I would argue that the kidnapping and the impregnating is kind of an extension of that grief. However twisted and morbid it might be, it's still a sense of grief, because I would argue that he's not in the right state of mind simply because of what he's lost.
I mean, after dealing with all that, they don't give a time frame of how quickly everything happened to him. But even still, dealing with that, with war, with losing his wife, with his daughter being killed, with no real sense of or feeling of justice for the outcome of it, you're not going to be in your right mind in general. But that whole subplot just, again, like I said, it felt like it was added in to make you not like him as a character and really kind of solidify that he's the bad guy, even though he was just defending his property up until you find out that point.
See, again, like I argue that it's grief. Like, let me ask you a question. Like, what's the strangest thing that you've ever done in your own grieving process?
So we've had some odd conversations about this, and my uncle just died a few months back, and for me, I knew what he believed. I knew where he thought he was going, and I knew he wasn't in pain anymore, because he had a lot of medical issues. I believe he was in like his early 90s. One of the best guys you'd ever meet, best people you'll ever meet. And for me, honestly, there really wasn't much grieving at all, because I knew what was going on. I knew what he thought was happening. I knew what my aunt believed. And as far as everybody was concerned, he was now in a better place and not suffering. So I didn't. For me, it was just okay, and it's something odd that with me in general. So that's kind of a difficult question for me to answer.
But not everyone's going to have that experience, and
exactly, and I know it's an unusual reaction.
And I also feel like there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be listening to this that probably can't relate to that. I feel like there are going to be people that are going to be like, oh man, like I'm not alone. Like I understand what Mark is talking about. And that's fine. I think for me, some of the strangest things that like I've ever done in terms of grieving is, some of just the things is like I want to watch like that person's like favorite movie, which isn't really a thing of grief. But then I've also had like really, sensitive times where like I will write like really melancholy songs, or like I just write, I just turn into like a complete emo for like an extended period of time to where like I don't want to talk to anyone, no one understands me kind of thing. And then I've also had moments where like I've gone through like I've lost someone who's very close and very dear to me, and I don't know how to process that. And so I go into something that's comfortable. And I've talked about it and shared about it before, where I have struggled in the past with pornography, and pornography has been a huge issue. And so a part of that addiction process and that grieving process meant that the pornography and became an escape away from the grief, because I didn't have to think about it. And so here, I think with Stephen Lang, I feel so bad calling him the blind man. So with
what's his character's name?
That's what he's credited as, is the blind man. Really? So yeah, I even looked it up on IMDb, and it's the blind man. Norman
Nordstrom, the blind man. His name is Norman.
Okay, so Norman has just lost the bare necessity, and I want to state that like I've never been to that level of depravity and grief, so I don't know what or how that feels to lose like everything. Like I don't think that like if I lost my wife, I don't think that I would be in the right state of mind to where I'd be like, oh, I'm gonna look at pornography and go hire hookers. Like, I don't think.
Yeah, I gotcha. It's just the way you phrase that.
Or like, oh, I'm gonna start like, turning to heroin or cocaine, or go out and kill a whole bunch of people. Like, I don't think that like I would be to that level of just not in my right state of mind, but also at the same time, like I don't know what that would yield. And it's kind of one of those things of like, you can think all you want, but until you're actually placed into that situation, you're never going to know how you're going to respond.
Right. Like, I thinking the worst I ever did was, I guess, dealing with my ex-wife and some of the fallout from the stunts that she pulled. I got to where I drank heavily for a long time. For about 6 months, I was constantly drinking. Now it just kind of, since then, turned into, if I'm pissed off, I'm not going to be around alcohol. Or I know better than to start drinking while I'm angry. Because just drink till it's pass out. But outside of that, it's just, I don't know. I feel like I'm an oddball in that whole dealing with grief scenario sometimes.
Well, I mean, it doesn't even have to be like necessarily like exclusively grief. It can be something along the lines of, just kind of, just having like a really crappy day. Like to bring up another film that I would eventually love to cover on Victims and Villains is Falling Down. Falling Down is just the story of one guy that like just one day just got pushed to the brink. And
so Falling Down is fantastic.
I love Falling Down.
And I feel like it's an underrated movie that's flown under the radar for a very long time. And over about the last year or two, I've started seeing clips of it popping up and people starting to talk about it. So I think it's really Michael Douglas in that movie is in some way you can relate to as a human being dealing with heavy traffic or shitty job, crappy people, divorce, just whatever it is. There's something in Falling Down you can relate to, and you can just go, yeah, I get why he finally just snapped and did what so many of us have dreamt about doing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that like I really like, you know, to just kind of pull from that, like that is kind of, you know, that, like you said, like it's kind of one thing that, you know, some of us I think have been in those types of jobs and just had those days to where like we felt like Michael Douglas. But again, like I don't think that like there are some of us listening that like, or even on the podcast that have understood that level of like extremity. Just because of X, Y, or Z reasons. And that's why it's, you know, when you kind of go through and you see his, Norman's grieving process throughout the entire film, it's hard to kind of connect to that level of depth of just how much he's lost, but also at the same time, it's not far-fetched to think, you know, this is just a guy that is just utterly broken and just alone and just doesn't have anyone that he can call on or, you know, trust.
It's almost like he got stuck in the anger stage.
Oh, 100%.
And just never progressed past anger.
Anger is the second step in the grieving process, and that's why I really want to stress, and that's why we create content like Victims and Villains, like That Type Praise, like Abyss Gazing, is so that, you know, we are continuously bringing up the conversation of mental health and continuously you know, encouraging people to walk out of those seasons, because those seasons, to stay there, are incredibly dangerous. It is incredibly toxic to stay in the anger stage. And with that, I also just want to encourage anyone listening to just click the link in the descriptions below and check out our mental health resource library, because we put these together, this resource library together, so that you can know that you have value, and that just because the thing that you're going through right now, you don't have to, it might suck, but you don't have to stay there.
Yeah, and dealing with anger and the whole stages of grief, you can, granted, Don't Breathe is an extreme, over the top example of an outcome, and anger in general can cause issues, but there's also a way you can almost channel it into creativity, and you end up with some art, things like art and music and things like that. So there are outlets if you feel like you're stuck kind of right there. There's ways, there's people you can talk to for help, of course, friends, family, even professionals. But there's also music has been linked to helping people process certain emotions and things like that. I'm a big, massive proponent of music and music therapy and things like that. So there's ways to work through it that obviously don't involve kidnapping people. So
yeah, it's an extreme thing.
Yeah. You get what I'm getting at.
Oh, 100%. And we've definitely talked about it before, the creative process, so to say, of making sure that you're putting your feelings into art, whether that's poetry, music, movies, podcasting. Like Victims and Villains was born as a podcast first and foremost, but it was born out of my own depression. It was born out of needing to do something creative and wanting to talk to people about nerdy stuff. And it's evolved into something beyond my wildest dreams of being a nonprofit, traveling, doing film festivals, conventions, spin-off podcasts, like all of that, and doing it now with people that I didn't know necessarily when we started this, that I've met along the way, whether that is Mark or other people like You Have to Watch This Podcast, Joshua Howell, even our editor-in-chief, Cam Smith. And, so there are such positive things that come out of seeking and placing that grieving process, or even depression or any other forms of like mental health issues, into something artistic.
Yeah, and it's just it's finding what works best for you and what connects the best for you. There's when you get into like the professional side of dealing with these things, with dealing with stress or anger or grief, they get into things like I mentioned earlier, like music therapy is one thing they use. They use just general therapy in general, but also like our art therapy is another thing they do. And I think things like depression and anger have been a major driving force in a lot of artistic expression. Like Van Gogh was notorious for being depressed and little off his rocker. But he would, according to historians, there would be like a blue character in his paintings that was his representation of himself in his own paintings and things like that. So it's getting stuck in it that causes the problem, that causes the issues, that's not healthy. But learning to deal with it is part of what makes people who they are.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today. Yeah, where you start to get stuck in it is where the unhealthiness actually comes from. And that's a great way of putting it, Mark, is that you want to find something that will help you walk out of it. And there are so many different types of therapy and outlets for you to walk out of it. And I talked specifically just a couple minutes ago about my depression in 2016 when I started this, and within 2 months of being able to do this, like, this became not only a passion and a driving force, but it allowed my focus to not get stuck in my depression. I had things that I was a lot more open and willing to talk about and share with people, rather than just bottling it up and dwelling on it, because it's in that dwelling stage where you really start to lose a lot of that. You just really start to like hang up on that kind of stuff, and that's really unhealthy, because eventually that you get like what Norman eventually ends up going to, with holding the girl hostage, and then even subsequently once she dies, that's when Rocky is very close to being impregnated as well. I really, really want to make a joke, and I'm curious if Norman swallows or not, but I digress. But that is a lot of like the results of him not dealing with the issues at hand. And the more you avoid them, the more that they are prolonged, the more unhealthy and more unstable your life becomes.
Well, it's with Don't Breathe, it's almost similar to Psycho when you think about it. Mm-hmm. Norman Bates just never really processed the death of his mom and moved on from it, to the point that it became a condition.
Oh, 100% agree. Psycho's a great example of that. And, one of the things that, to kind of jump onto another scene in this, while Norman is kind of the example of like the unhealthy measure of like holding on to stuff, on the flip side, you have Rocky. One of the best scenes I think of in this movie is the scene where it's her and Alex in the car, and Alex turns to her and he's like, "Hey, is that a new tattoo?" And she's like, "Yeah." And she's giving this monologue about why she chose to get a ladybug tattooed on her. And there are great scenes where she has with the ladybug, and this scene kind of puts into perspective the importance of it. But she basically describes this like really horrific event that her mom and dad kind of had done to her. And really what helps make this so impactful is that she basically reveals that she got locked into a trunk, and there was a ladybug that kind of flew up and just kept her company. And it just served as a reminder to her that life is going to get better. Like, she's not always going to be this miserable. And it's such a small reminder, but she gets it tattooed onto her. And I think it's such a beautiful example that the littlest things in life, or some of the most unexpected things, can bring hope and breakthrough. And the ladybug story and kind of Rocky's holding on to that truth are beautiful examples of that.
Yeah, well, one of the comments she makes is once she gets to California, she's going to have the tattoo of the ladybug colored in, and that's going to be the last mark she ever has put on herself. And it's almost like she's seeing it as a way to close the door on her past and move on and become something else. I believe ladybugs are supposed to be like a sign of good luck, I think. And it kind of all falls in line with that she sees it as like a symbol of hope almost, and a future more than what she's used to now.
Do you have like, what would be your ladybug if you had to kind of like put together like a symbol or like something that you hold on to?
Oh God, why would you ask me something like that? Um,
That's why.
I mean, I look forward to a lawn chair on my front porch yelling at the kids to get off my lawn, but I don't think that counts.
Mark just gets a tattoo of a lawn chair.
With the old Clint Eastwood wrinkly face.
For me, I definitely have actually a few of them tattooed onto my body already. Mark and I, we listen to kind of similar music, but from different generations and eras of it. We both really like heavy metal. And heavy metal was when I was like really depressed as a teenager and really went through it. I was at like probably the lowest point that I was going to be at in my life. And one of the things that really helped me get through it was this album that I'm going to share something, and call me crazy if you will. If you think I'm crazy, that's cool. I'm down with that. But the album, there's a line in the album. It says, I know because my feet have the scars to show. And it's Under Oath's Define the Great Line. It's a 2006 album. And I got it tattooed on me because it was the first time that like I've ever legitimately heard the audible voice of God. And for me, it was this time that, I don't necessarily need to feel depressed or to kind of go or endure this, because I believe that I have a savior like already went and took that stuff for me. And so not to, I don't want to get into like a whole religion's like offshoot on this episode, but like that album and like the symbol that comes with it has always kind of been a constant reminder of where I was and the power that faith and hope have served in my life to kind of preserve and keep me moving forward.
So you mentioning musical lyrics brought so one that's kind of stuck for me recently over the past few years was actually a line from Gateways by Demuth. Be the broken or the breaker. In other words, you make your own decisions. You're responsible for your own outcomes. You can be what you want to be. And it's kind of a train of thought I've had for a long time, is that I'm going to do what I'm going to do, regardless of what anyone else thinks. And it may be, I don't know, it's an interesting way of thinking in general. And it helps almost rationalize certain ways of thinking, acting, reacting. It boils down to that was your personal decision in some way.
Yeah. And again, like I think that one of the things that, we've had plenty of conversations off air, but, to the similarities between both of the stories is that music has had such this like definitive impact on our lives and kind of like what we define as like hope, or what has kept us moving forward and has been our own ladybug. And I think that's such a beautiful sentiment about this movie, is that for as insane as it is and as gory and as like just how much it draws you to the edge of your seat, that you still have these tender moments, because it's such a, and it sets the film in like such a unbelievable realism, where you look at something like just how crazy life is, but how it still offers you these like tender moments of like a child's first step, or parents taking their kids out to college, or wedding days or funerals, or so many other different things. I don't know why I put funerals in there. I like funerals. Anyways, I'm weird like Mark. But it offers so much of these like tender moments, and I feel like that's really what helps this film stand out so much, is that it is it's able to walk in those beautiful moments while still maintaining that intensity.
Yeah, and with them announcing that they were doing a second one and it coming out here within the coming weeks, it leaves you curious of how they're going to progress that story in general. Is Rocky going to have any role in it at all now that she's gone away, but seeing that he's still alive, or is it just going to be turned into another horror violent franchise and you lose any of the character that was built in the original?
Yeah, that's kind of one of my fears too, is that I am optimistically hopeful for this film to kind of be as good as the original. But I mean, it's Fidel, I think is the guy's Fidel Alvarez, the writer director of this movie, does such a impressive job with this movie that I feel like it stands alone completely by itself 100% in all. Like it definitely is so amazing the way that it is, that it doesn't really need one. And I think that you kind of start to get into territory where by sequelizing it, you run the risk of, I don't want to say cheapening, because like I can still act like the second one doesn't exist, but it's also at the same time like, it's like, man, like, did we really need this one? Because you take really compelling characters, and I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that it might be a sequel like Saw. When you look at Saw's original history, that was a movie that was meant to be this like one-off, and they continued it and made it a really compelling lore. And I know it's not for everyone. I know that there are people that don't like it. I grew up on it. I love that franchise, and a part of the reason
I love Saw. Saw wasn't that one of James Wan's early work? He got into horror.
That was James Wan's actual debut. Yeah. And so, but it never began with that film. It never. When James and Lee Winnell set out to do the first film, they never intended to do sequels. But if you have the right people and the right talent and you're telling the right story, you can still make compelling stories to follow your strong opening. I am hoping that Don't Breathe will take after that.
Well, with Saw, yeah, the original was just, I remember reading about the development of it, that it was essentially a horror movie based in a single room. And it did branch out from that, but the sequels became, to me, when I watched them, it became more about how the traps were and how grotesque they could be than the underlying story of the background of Jigsaw and Tobin Bell's character and stuff.
Oh yeah. So I think we're both kind of optimistic for it. So let's go ahead and let us know what you guys think about Don't Breathe. Let us know what your butterfly is. Tweet to us Ladybug at Victims and Villains, because we would love to kind of continue and hear from you guys in terms of that stuff. But you guys can find our other podcast, the Abyss Gazing, a horror podcast, wherever on the feed you're currently listening to this. So go check out our episodes so far. We've done Ghoulies, and we've done the original 1973 The Wicker Man. Mark, where can people find you online, sir?
Titanium Juggernaut Painting on Instagram is really all I have right now.
Well, so go ahead and follow him over there. You guys can also find me on Letterboxd. I'm at Captain Nostalgia. It's man. So to follow my 2021 film journey, and also you guys can find us everywhere at Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, Patreon, and Ko-fi. If you guys, the latter two, you guys can actually help support this show and support the nonprofit to help us get mental health resources into schools, churches, film festivals, and conventions. All of it goes towards our cause. So all of which you guys can find at victimsandvillains.net, including past episodes, movie reviews, and most importantly, our mental health resource library, all of which you guys can find in the show notes below. So make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button, and until next time, remember, hold your breath.